Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive with us. Today, we're going deep into the true crime world to uncover the story of Laron Williams.
Ooh, okay.
You might not recognize the name
Right.
right away, but trust me, this one's got it all. Murder, prison escapes, and a whole lot of unanswered questions.
Sounds juicy.
Yeah, so to help me break down this case, I'm joined by expert name. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, Laron Williams, this guy's a real enigma. We've got court records, news articles, even some interviews he gave while on death row. Where do we even start with this one?
Well, even his origins are hazy. Like,
Oh.
he claimed to have been born outside the U.S. in 1939, but the details about his childhood are constantly shifting, potentially fabricated.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he mentioned a father in the Army, moving around a lot, even a stint in a town called Newarton.
Newarton.
Yeah, a place that no one seems to be able to locate.
Wow. Newark Kington. Sounds like he was trying to create a fictional backstory even before his life took a criminal turn.
It's certainly possible. He also claimed to have studied psychology in college.
Oh, wow.
But again, there's no concrete evidence to support this. It makes you wonder, what was he trying to achieve with these fabrications? Was it a need to appear more intelligent, more manipulative?
It's almost like he was laying the groundwork for the slippery, elusive character he would become. Right. But even with all the mystery surrounding his past, there's one thing we know for sure. His connection to the tragic murder of Tara Wedlaw in Nashville, Tennessee back in 1977.
Yeah,
This is the crime that really put Laron Williams on the map.
exactly. Tara Wedlaw was a young woman who had recently moved to Nashville.
Okay.
She was involved in sex work, and in October of 1977, she crossed paths with Williams at the Pagoda Garden Apartments.
So walk us through what happened. How did their encounter turn deadly?
So Williams and Wedlaw went to a nearby motel,
Okay.
and after a sexual encounter, Williams strangled her.
Oh, wow.
It's a brutal crime.
Yeah.
And what's particularly striking is the way the police were led to Williams.
They found Tara's birth certificate in his possession, right?
Right.
Yeah. Seems like an incredibly careless mistake for a would-be criminal mastermind.
It does, almost like a rookie move.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder if there was an element of impulsivity to his crimes,
Uh-huh.
something that might contradict the image of a calculated, organized offender.
That's interesting because while Williams was awaiting trial for Tara's murder, the police started looking into him for other unsolved cases in Nashville. Specifically, the murders of Mary Jo Korn, who also went by Larissa Ann Marseille,
Oh, wow.
and Bessie Wallace. Both young women, both found strangled, their hands and feet bound with rope. This sounds more like the work of a methodical, organized killer.
Yes, these cases share some chilling similarities with the Wedlaw murder.
Right.
It raises the question, are we looking at the classic MO modus operandi of a serial killer, which is essentially their signature, their repeated method of operation?
So what does Williams's MO tell us about him, and how do we reconcile these seemingly contradictory elements of impulsivity and meticulous planning?
Well, in the cases of Korn and Wallace, we see elements often associated with organized offenders.
Okay.
The control exhibited in binding the victims, the selection of a particular victim type, and the attempt to control the crime scene.
Yeah.
However, the seemingly careless mistake with Tara Wedlaw's birth certificate points to a potential impulsivity, which is more characteristic of a disorganized offender.
So maybe we're dealing with someone who straddles both categories, someone who can be both methodical and reckless.
Right.
It paints a much more complex picture of Williams's psychology.
Exactly. And that complexity only deepens when we look at what happened to Williams next. Remember, all of this is happening while he's in jail, awaiting trial for Tara's murder. But even behind bars, he wasn't exactly keeping a low profile.
Right. He was attacked by other inmates at one point. What do we know about that incident? Was it just a random prison brawl, or could it reveal something more about Williams's personality or the perception others had of him?
It's hard to say for sure, but it definitely suggests he wasn't just blending into the background.
Yeah.
He may have had a confrontational nature, a way of carrying himself that rubbed others the wrong way, or maybe those inmates suspected he was capable of more than just the crime he was accused of.
It certainly adds another layer of intrigue to his story. So tell me, how did he end up escaping from prison?
Williams ultimately pleaded guilty to Tara Wedlaw's murder in 1979.
Okay.
He received a 10-year sentence. However, his time behind bars was short-lived. In 1981, he managed to escape from the Memphis Correctional Center, and his story takes a very dark turn.
So this wasn't just a simple escape, was it?
No, it wasn't. It marked the beginning of a much more violent chapter in Laron Williams' story. Within days of his escape, he was involved in a fatal confrontation with law enforcement.
You're talking about the murder of Lieutenant Clarence Cox,
Right.
a 23-year veteran of the Memphis Police Department. It seems like such a brazen act, especially so soon after escaping prison.
It was. Lieutenant Cox tried to apprehend Williams on May 12, 1981.
Okay.
There was a struggle, and Williams managed to get hold of the officer's gun, shooting him point blank.
It feels like such a dramatic escalation of violence, even for someone with Williams's history.
It was a turning point, for sure.
Yeah.
The murder of a police officer instantly raised the stakes.
Right.
Capturing Williams became a top priority, and it sent shockwaves through the community.
Uh-huh.
But tragically, Lieutenant Cox wasn't his only victim during this time.
Just 2 days later, Williams was in Jackson, Tennessee.
Yeah.
He burglarized St. Mary's Roman Catholic Church and fatally shot the assistant pastor, Reverend John J. Jackson.
Right.
It's hard to believe he went from a prison escape to killing a police officer and a clergyman in just a matter of days.
I know.
What triggered this shift towards seemingly more impulsive, more violent acts?
It's a question that has puzzled investigators for years.
Yeah.
Some believe the pressure of being a fugitive, constantly looking over his shoulder, pushed him to a breaking point. Others think these were crimes of opportunity born out of desperation and a need to avoid recapture.
But wouldn't the stress of being on the run make him more likely to be disorganized? How does that fit with the potential for premeditation we saw in the Nashville cases?
That's a great question, and it highlights the complexities of Williams's personality and criminal behavior.
Yeah.
It's possible that his time in prison, even that brief period, hardened him, exposed him to more violent subculture that influenced his actions.
We did learn about the attack by fellow inmates while he was awaiting trial for Tara Wedlaw's murder. Perhaps that experience played a role in this shift.
Absolutely. That incident suggests he was already navigating dangerous power dynamics even within the prison walls. It's possible he adopted a more aggressive, even ruthless persona as a survival mechanism, which may have carried over into his actions after the escape.
So after these two murders, how long was he able to evade capture?
His reign of terror was thankfully short-lived. Just 3 days after the murder of Reverend Jackson, Williams was apprehended at a restaurant near a motel where he was staying.
Okay.
His run from the law was finally over, but his legal battles were just beginning.
He was facing two separate trials for the murders of Lieutenant Cox and Reverend Jackson, both carrying the possibility of the death penalty. Did he maintain his innocence throughout these trials?
He did, actually.
Oh, wow.
He claimed he believed his convictions would be overturned and he would eventually be a free man again.
Oh, really?
Some saw this as delusional, a desperate attempt to cling to hope.
Yeah.
Others saw as yet another example of his manipulative nature, a way to control the narrative even when facing overwhelming evidence.
It sounds like he was trying to maintain that air of mystery and control he had cultivated throughout his life.
Yeah.
But the juries didn't buy it, did they?
No, they didn't. He was found guilty in both trials and sentenced to death by electrocution. Laron Williams, the man who seemed to vanish into thin air so easily, was now facing the most definitive end.
But there's another twist in this story, isn't there? He never actually made it to the electric chair.
That's right. Laron Williams met a violent end, but not at the hands of the state. In July of 1985, while on death row at the Tennessee State Prison, he was fatally attacked by fellow inmates.
Beaten to death by other prisoners. What could have possibly led to that? Was there some sort of power struggle? The gang rivalry?
It's ironic, almost unbelievable. But the attack stemmed from something incredibly mundane. He was using the prison phone too much.
The prison phone?
Yeah.
You're telling me that a man condemned to death was killed over excessive phone use?
It sounds absurd, but that's the reality of prison life sometimes.
Wow.
It's a pressure cooker environment where even minor infractions can have deadly consequences.
Yeah.
It seems that Williams' phone habits angered some of the other inmates and they decided to take matters into their own hands.
A grim and ironic end for a man condemned to death. It raises a lot of unsettling questions about the nature of justice, the prevalence of vigilante violence, and the often brutal realities of prison life. But even with his death, Laron Williams' story doesn't feel quite finished, does it?
It doesn't. We're left with lingering questions about his past, his motives, and the full extent of his crimes. Those unanswered questions are what we'll explore in the final part of our deep dive.
We know Laron Williams was convicted of killing Tara Wedlaw, Lieutenant Cox, and Reverend Jackson, but there were those other suspected murders in Nashville and even the possibility of crimes in other states. Do you think we'll ever know the full extent of his crimes?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The cases of Mary Jo Corn and Bessie Wallace were never officially linked to Williams,
Right.
but the similarities in their deaths to Tara Woodlaw's murder are hard to ignore.
Yeah.
All three women were found strangled, nude, with their hands and feet bound.
Yeah.
It's a disturbingly consistent pattern that fits with what we know about his potential for both organized and disorganized behavior.
And then there were those investigations in other states,
Right.
Georgia, Oregon, even Washington and Illinois, where he lived for a time. Why weren't any of those cases ever definitively tied to him? Was it just his ability to slip through the cracks to create new identities and disappear?
That's part of it, for sure.
Hmm.
Williams was a master manipulator, constantly changing his story and creating aliases. It made it incredibly difficult for investigators to track his movements and establish concrete connections between him and potential crimes.
But it was also a different era in law enforcement, wasn't it? We didn't have the same tools and technology back then.
Remember, this was all happening before DNA technology was widely used in criminal investigations.
Right.
Relying on eyewitness accounts, often unreliable, and piecing together circumstantial evidence across different jurisdictions was a monumental task.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible that Williams committed other crimes that will never be officially attributed to him.
It's a chilling thought, so many potential victims, so many families left without answers. But even with all these unanswered questions, we've managed to piece together quite a bit about Laron Williams. He was a chameleon, a master manipulator, capable of both meticulous planning and impulsive violence. His story is a twisted journey through the dark side of human nature.
It certainly is, and I think it ultimately leaves us with one overarching question. What creates a monster like Laron Williams? Was there something inherently evil within him, or was he a product of his circumstances? A broken soul shaped by trauma and hardship?
It's a question that criminologists and psychologists have grappled with for centuries. Nature versus nurture. Are some people simply born bad, or are they made that way through a series of unfortunate events, perhaps abuse or neglect in their past?
We may never have a definitive answer, but by delving into cases like Laron Williams's, by examining the complexities of his personality, his crimes, and his life, we can at least begin to understand the forces that shape individuals and the choices they make.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the life and crimes of Laron Williams, a man who left behind more questions than answers. We've explored the known facts, delved into the mysteries, and grappled with the larger questions about human nature that his story evokes. If this case has piqued your interest, I encourage you to continue exploring. Dig into those old newspaper archives, pore over the court documents, and see if you can uncover any new insights into this complex and disturbing case. Until next time, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.